Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. For the last few Authority File series, I've been telling you all about our new podcast called Patron Driven. It's coming up in late June, and we're really excited for you to hear it. It's going to be much different than the Authority File. It's a lot like the narrative-style podcasts many of you have probably listened to. It's much more story-driven. Season 1 is a 5-part series that follows 4 librarians through the destruction of the Lone Star College Kingwood Library after Hurricane Harvey, the 2 years it took to rebuild, and the new space, services, and relationships that emerged from it all. It's such a great story. It's got drama, grit, perseverance, and it's a terrific library success story. Patron Driven debuts in late June wherever you get your podcasts. You can visit our website, choice360.org, to learn more about it. Click on the librarianship drop-down to find the patron-driven landing page where you can access more info and sign up for email updates. While you're there, you'll find behind-the-scenes bonus content for the new program, and you can check out the new trailer for the upcoming series. Okay, so back to the Authority File. My guest for the series is Sarah Todd, who, along with Sébastien Savard, co-edited the book Canadian Perspectives on Community Development, published by University of Ottawa Press. Through its contributed pieces, the book takes an incredibly thorough look at how community work is practiced in Canada. As you can imagine, community work in Canada, but anywhere really, is complex, which gives rise to a diverse set of practices that makes it difficult to think of a quote-unquote Canadian approach to social work. This is what Sarah and Sébastien address in their book, looking for the through lines in that complexity of community development, particularly in forging new pathways of communication between Anglophone and Francophone communities. This is episode 4, our final episode of this series, which is brought to you by the University of Ottawa Press, and Sarah and I discuss the ways in which the book reimagines community work and what the future holds for the practice. Okay, so I'm wondering if you could provide some examples from the book that actually challenge some of the existing theory or practice. What kind of sticks out for you in that regard?
I think so. I'll start with Lynn Lavallee's chapter, which looks at sport activities as a way of working with Indigenous communities and particularly Indigenous youth. And I like that chapter because it both embraces what is commonly understood as Indigenous approaches to community organizing, which is about healing and connection and that kind of thing, but it uses a sport frame, which is a kind of unique approach to thinking through community development and also for bringing together indigeneity and community development in a way that kind of disrupts how we often think about indigenous knowledge as being older, and instead it sort of turns this on its head and reproduces it as a youthful practice and a playful practice, which I think is really interesting. And then that sort of moves into the next chapter that takes up arts as a way of disrupting the notion that as we all get older, we become more disengaged and disconnected, and that's part of an aging cycle. And instead, Moody and Finney bring art together to say, actually, aging can be an opportunity for connection and creativity. So these are approaches that disrupt how we imagine communities and also how we imagine specific approaches to community work with them. I think another one that's really quite an interesting rework is Bill Lee and his group, who take up a focus on trauma in many marginalized communities. They focus on queer communities and Indigenous communities and refugee communities, and really ask community workers to think about trauma not as a weakness, but as an important impact. It impacts how people function and connect with each other, and thus community work needs to involve recovery and healing. And it's not just, in order to get to social justice, it's not just about your technique and your analysis, but it's when we're dealing with trauma, it's about humility and patience and compassion and recognition, trying to really help communities recognize and be recognized as having collective trauma. I think then you jump across the country to Chouinard's work, focusing on Acadian communities in New Brunswick who have these long histories of volunteerism and nonprofit organizing and cooperation, uh, and really highlight the creativity and innovation that can happen uh, with universities and rural communities working together, which in most other parts of this country would be seen as having such power inequities that it may be may actually be impossible. And instead, the authors sort of articulate models of collective leadership and solidarity that um, invigorate research as a project towards social justice. So there's such varied contributions that reimagine community practice in that way. And then there's other chapters like Dylan Black's look at queer and trans organizing and the theories that come out of there to that bring a really important challenge to traditional feminist theories of approaches to particularly violence against women, and ask us to rethink violence and rethink gender in ways that can invigorate an anti-violent kind of community approach. And similarly, Okiuto, who wrote a chapter with me later in the book, look at post-structuralism and how taking a theoretical approach that asks questions offers something different for community work. It's not the solutions that are evident, but it's a really self-reflective kind of contribution to the work, and drawing on that theory changes the kinds of practices that we engage in. So there's so many examples, but those are a few that I think really reimagine existing theory and practice. And then I should say, like, there's some chapters like Camo, who takes up poverty, who says some of these traditional ways of doing things in terms of taxation and redistribution of economics, we need to not forget that those are fundamental ways of addressing poverty. So it's not always that we need something new. Sometimes we also need to look at older ways of doing things that need not to be forgotten because they made differences and they are important for communities.
Right, right. Yeah, one thing that stood out for me as you were describing some of the chapters and their approaches is that was it Bill Lee you said who how he kind of talked about trauma. It sounds like he kind of flipped the script a little bit and talked about a shared experience or characteristic across communities rather than focusing on a particular community itself. And that it sounded like there were other examples of that kind of approach throughout the book as well, right?
Yes, these are where some of the chapters beautifully are in conversation with each other. Not that we planned it, but it just happened, thankfully. So Lee's team really looks at that connection through trauma from research where they really spoke to community workers and community members, and through that research, connection and continuity was what they discovered. In a different way, Jane Koo looks at immigrants and refugees and migrant workers and says we need to start thinking about the connections between those different groups of people who have different immigration status and move around the world in different ways, rather than taking the state's division. And she uses theory to conceptualize that the state makes these categories to facilitate global labor and production. And she breaks them down from that perspective. And so I think the two chapters are interesting to put in conversation with each other because from two different perspectives, they ask us to really think about how we understand the boundaries around particular communities, and to ask questions about, does that serve the community, both in a really practical feeling level, and in a very politicized level, and that those questions are really important, and valuable to the project of community work for social justice.
Mm. Yeah, so this is really fascinating how, as you said, the chapters kind of end up having this conversation among themselves, and it sounds like that's kind of one of the ways the volume is sort of having this something cohesive about it, even though there's such a disparate group of theories and contexts explained within it. Um, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that in terms of the volume overall, and how you and Sébastien, and maybe you didn't, but how the two of you attempted to um, provide some sort of cohesiveness among, with the volume as a whole, or did that just kind of come together more organically and sort of serendipitously?
Mm-hmm. So I don't think we were aiming for cohesion. I think connection, definitely
Okay.
connection,
Good.
was something that we were looking for. I think some of this comes from understanding, uh, when we talk about inclusivity and trying to bring everybody in, that there's groups like Indigenous groups who say your model of inclusivity and trying to bring us all in hasn't worked out so well for us. We're not so interested in that. Like, we want to walk together and beside each other. We want to talk and respect to each other, but we don't want you to bring us all into the same space, because it doesn't, it removes our autonomy and our ability. So I think in the collection, we wanted all the chapters to be in conversation with each other, but we certainly didn't push any of the authors to sort of say, this is the link, this is the boundary, stay within the boundary. It's more like, the project was more to say, in your journey, as you walk and explain in your chapter what's happening in your communities, we're going to try to look for connections to other communities, and we ask you to also look for that, and that connection is what holds the book together, in all its diversity and disparity, right? Like, I think that it's still, there are conversations to be had.
Excellent. Um, after completing the book, I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the insights, maybe perhaps that's provided for you and Sébastien, in terms of what the sort of outlook for or the future of community work in Canada might look like. Again, I know this is a very top level question, but what are some areas that are showing promise, that have the potential for some amazing future development? What areas need specific work? What are your thoughts on where community work is going?
So, yeah, I think the text points to a sort of tension towards the future, and that's, it articulates that sometimes in our work and in the hard work that is there, we get tired and we forget to ask questions, and we move to the familiar. Um, and I think the text as a whole encourages us to think about the idea that there's multiple futures, and that we can expand the future if we learn more about each other, because there are other people working towards social justice who have a very different vision of what that justice is, who have a very different vision of that future, and that's not a problem, unless we stop having conversations with each other and asking new questions about what we're doing. And I think that the beauty about the theories in these collections is they don't give the answers and solutions. What they do is they open up possibility. And I think that's where freedom lies, right? Like freedom isn't in the sort of the solutions and answers. It's often in what we can imagine beyond those solutions and answers. And I see a lot of that in this text, that it's not, here's a set of answers of what to do with this community or that community, or how to deal with this social problem. It's, here's how we could imagine a way to work with this social problem and to think about how we could move forward. And I think for me, that's hopeful. Me, the text is hopeful because I can imagine new futures with it. And I think that's kind of what we need at this point in time.
Excellent. Yeah, I would agree. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us on the program. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this book.
You just heard from Sarah Todd. Sarah is professor and director of the School of Social Work at Carleton University in Ottawa. She is also a 3M teaching fellow. She is the co-editor of Canadian Perspectives on Community Development, along with Sébastien Savard, who is full professor and interim director of the School of Social Work at the University of Ottawa. Canadian Perspectives on Community Development is published by the University of Ottawa Press. This episode is brought to you by the University of Ottawa Press. If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice, and if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.